Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
23 pesos.
We only have 10.
Okay. I give you the 10 peso version.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. Welcome back. We're back from a break. I'm here with Chad Gross. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Excited to be back. I did miss podcasting, and I missed you, man. So I'm glad to be back.
Yeah, where were we? We were on holidays. Basically, it gets very busy preparing to go on a 2-week trip. I live in Northern Ireland and went back to Michigan for 2 weeks, and there was definitely no time to be recording on the holiday and leading up to it. Decided, let's just take a little breather, and so it was a welcome little break, but now we're back in the saddle.
Yes. Hey, I had to share something. As listeners of the podcast know, we are Ghostbusters fans, and I discovered something I had no idea about that existed in the world of Ghostbusters. You know how I'm a fan of cartoons, and I watched the cartoon The Real Ghostbusters, and that dropped on Amazon Prime, all the seasons. Yeah, so
dear.
I couldn't sleep the other night, and I was like, and I think there's 10 seasons.
And you were so happy about that. I'm so glad I've got insomnia right now.
So I thought, I'm just going to skip through, and read the episode descriptions and see what they're about. And you're never going to guess who was in one of the episodes.
A character or like an 80s actor?
No, it's a character from movie 1.
Oh.
That I had no idea was in the series.
I have no idea.
My name is Peck.
Walter Peck.
Walter Peck was in the, and I was, down in the basement. It's like 12:30 at night, and I stumble across this. And I'm freaking out, like, Walter Peck was in this. And so in the episode, Walter Peck has lost his job with the EPA because of what happened and the events that transpired in the first Ghostbusters. And so now he works for a new organization, and he's trying to take the Ghostbusters down again. And by the end of the episode, he loses his job again. But they made him the animated version of him. I'll have to find a picture and send it to you. But it was wild. But it was just so cool that I got more Walter Peck. Wow. I didn't know I needed more Walter Peck in my life.
Now, I'm assuming it was a different voice actor.
It was a different voice actor.
Sad.
Yes.
Sad.
But it was still fun.
Uh-huh.
And then the other thing that I did, and you may have been more privy to these than me, but you know Walter Martin, the late Walter Martin. He wrote Kingdom of the Cults. He's the first Bible answer man. I stumbled across one of his discussions that he had on the John Ankerberg show.
Yeah.
And man, I have been watching his debates, and they're kind of a little bit of a hidden treasure I didn't know I needed.
Wow.
And he debates things that you don't see debated often. Is Seventh-day Adventist is that a cult? Things like that, and Pentecostal oneness and things. And so it's just been great to go back and watch. But the best part is the transitions. Mm-hmm. On the show are like pure 70s and 80s, like,
yeah.
So those are pretty fun. So those are a couple things that I've been up to. One less important than the other. I will let listeners decide which one is which.
Well, we'll be sure to link to those things on Amazon Prime in the show notes, especially the episode with Walter Peck and Walter Martin, of course.
Exactly.
Well, we've got an episode that we've been looking forward to for some time here. Our guest today is Dr. Lydia McGrew. We'll point right over to her bio on her Lydia McGrew homepage, so you can find her details at lydiamcgrew.com. Her husband is Dr. Timothy McGrew, so if you haven't drawn that connection already or aren't familiar with them, they're a wonderful couple who are doing good work in apologetics and have made a tremendous contribution. Some of Lydia's books include The Eye of the Beholder, The Gospel of John as Historical Reportage, one called The Mirror or the Mask, Liberating the Gospels from Literary Devices, Hidden in Plain View, Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospels and Acts. We're going to be talking to Lydia about making a case for the resurrection. And a lot of people are familiar with what's called a minimal facts approach, made popular by Gary Habermas and Mike Licona. And so that basically takes a small number of facts that are agreed upon by scholars and that are well evidenced. And you use that to say, well, what's the best explanation of these facts? Then basically make a concise and abbreviated case using small amount of data to point to the resurrection. So I'm interested in talking to Lydia today because she would argue that we should look at as much data as possible, or instead of saying a minimal facts approach, you take a maximal data approach. That's what we're going to be unpacking today. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm excited to talk to her as well. I watched an interview that she did with Cameron Bertuzzi on Capturing Christianity, and I've always approached kind of this idea of maximal facts, the maximal case for the resurrection versus the minimal facts case for the resurrection, as it depended on the audience that you were talking to, and one might be more beneficial than the other depending on how much time you have and depending on the knowledge that the person holds that you're talking to. And she actually kind of made a bolder argument in her discussion with Cameron and said something to the effect of that the minimal facts argument is actually faulty, and that we shouldn't use it because it is actually just not a good argument to use. And so I'm interested to talk to her more about it because in the past, in my own discussions with skeptics and things, I've seen fruit from the minimal facts argument. And so I'm hoping to learn and certainly open to having my mind changed or even corrected on where I'm in error.
So yeah, looking forward to this discussion. And for any further resources, we want to point you to lydiamcgrew.com. And also we'll link to her YouTube channel. All those tasty tidbits can be found in the show notes. So without any further ado, let's go talk to Lydia.
Let's get ready. Switch me on.
Lydia McGrew, thanks for joining us for the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
Well, Chad and I have been really, looking forward to this conversation about talking about the resurrection and how we can make a case for that. And so, but before we get into those questions, maybe people should know, well, what's a bit about your background and how did you get into doing apologetics and this sort of topic?
Well, my husband, Tim McGrew, is a philosopher, a professional philosopher, teaches at Western Michigan University, and he and I began doing epistemology together more than 20 years ago now. So even though my PhD is in English, virtually all of my publications are in philosophy. At first, we jointly wrote, and then I took off on my own, and I've got a pretty long publication list in epistemology and formal epistemology, so probability theory and that kind of thing. Then he began doing work on the history of apologetics arguments, like the history of the deist controversy and that kind of thing. He actually got a grant for that some years ago. And he came upon this argument called the argument from undesigned coincidences, and he was tremendously excited about that. He introduced me to that, and we agreed it needed to be brought into the modern audience. It needed to be made available. So we agreed whichever of us got the opportunity, the time to do that first would write a book to modernize the argument from undesigned coincidence, present it to a modern audience. And that happened to be me. So that was my first New Testament book published in 2017, Hidden in Plain View. So from then on, I got more and more interested in New Testament studies and sort of a cross-disciplinary application of probability to New Testament. And so I've written 2 more books since then, written a number of articles. I published a number of peer-reviewed articles as well in New Testament. And now for a couple of years now, I've also had, or maybe it's 1 year, I can't even remember, I've had a YouTube channel on the Gospels reliability.
Well, great. Looking forward to talking about the resurrection in this case. And so you mentioned Dr. Timothy McGrew there, looking at historical apologetics and that sort of a thing. And my question is, when we're making a case for the resurrection of Jesus, would it help people to know how that's been defended throughout history? And what do you think have been common approaches or methods that have been used?
I think it certainly can be helpful, especially because it can, as C.S. Lewis pointed out, kind of break us out of the parochialism or bias of just our own time period. So certainly I think that Tim's bringing to light some of these 19th century approaches has been really helpful, because what we've realized is that the approach of, say, William Paley to the resurrection, it was never refuted. It just fell out of fashion. And realizing that is a really enlightening kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Where would, if listeners wanted to find that argument from Paley, where would they look for that?
In Paley's own words, a view of the evidences of Christianity.
Okay.
I mean, it's kind of big, but, it's available for free because it's not in copyright anymore. So
free
you
is...
could just Google it. Free is hard to beat, right?
Free is always good. Yes. Especially for people like me who have a bit of a book obsession. So one of the ways that has become popular recently is what's known as the minimal facts argument. This is probably popularized and known to most often to people like Gary Habermas or Mike Licona. Craig's approach is a little bit different, but in some cases, I think it's almost a distinction without a difference. How would you characterize, what is the minimal facts argument for listeners who aren't familiar with it?
Yeah, it's been popular for, I would say, about a generation. I think that Dr. Habermas was really advocating this even in the late 20th century, early 21st century. And so you could really say that a generation of apologists has really grown up on it in a sense. So,
yes.
So the minimal facts approach is the attempt to argue for the resurrection of Jesus. Usually it's cast as an inference to the best explanation. And the idea is to take a small picked number of propositions, which are known as the minimal facts, which are acknowledged by a very large variety and number and percentage of scholars. And when I say variety, the idea is, as they'll sometimes say, across the scholarly spectrum, so that it's not just Christians, it's not just conservatives, it's not just liberals, but you can find people with a bunch of different labels who would all acknowledge these facts, often based upon the literature surveys that Dr. Habermas has done. These are not published, by the way, as raw data. So it's what he's published are his summaries of what he believes he found when he interpreted this. And it's also useful to know these were not based on polling. I mean, in other words, it wasn't like he wrote a bunch of questions and, please say yes, no, maybe, and explain in your own words. It was rather that he read articles and then from that concluded the percentage of the authors of those articles that held these things to be true. And so then the idea is that you constrain yourself, and they'll admit, it's kind of an artificial constraint, to facts that are granted in preference. Habermas said 90% or more, and also this varied consensus. And then if you can support the resurrection by arguing that it's the best explanation of those facts, then the idea is that you have a really strong argument, because even though those authors wouldn't draw that conclusion, if they're non-believers, they really should. And you're not going to have to debate with your listeners because, you're going to say to them, well, you're going up against this huge majority of scholars. So it's supposed to be, in a sense, a kind of a shortcut and have a lot of force in that way.
Why do you think, this is one of the things I was, looking forward to asking you, why do you think the argument has become so popular? Because honestly, if I'm being honest, until people like you and Dr. McClatchy and Eric Manning through his YouTube channel really started the last few years, at least it started becoming more on my radar. I'm not saying you've only been doing it for a few years. It became on my radar. I had really only heard the minimal facts case. So I'm just curious as to why do you think it's so popular?
Yeah, and it's funny because, to my mind, a generation isn't that long. It's funny that there's so many people who haven't heard of anything else. And I'm like, come to think of it, in broad scale historical terms, this is just a blip on the on the screen. And yet so many people know of nothing else. I think a big factor in that is debates. That apologetics has become so associated with debates. And Dr. Habermas is an experienced debater. Dr. William Lane Craig and Mike Licona, those three people, they're known for debating skeptics. And people love to watch debates. And so when this is what you're seeing being done, boom, 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 in debates, it just becomes extremely familiar, and the idea becomes, well, how am I going to do a debate if I don't use this method because anything else would take so long or it wouldn't go over well in a debate or that kind of thing. And I think that's a big feature. And then just again, just sociological factors, if the big name figures in the area, this is what they're doing, then this is what everybody else is going to do.
Mm-hmm. I know you've been, you are a proponent of what's known as the maximal facts, which we'll get into, in a moment. But I was curious as to, do you think there's any strength to the minimal facts argument? Like, could you say like, well, at least this is a strength of it? Or would you just say it's something we should abandon completely?
Well, that's a good question. I saw that on the list, on the question list ahead of time. And I thought, how am I going to answer this? So I would make a sort of analogy. I'm gonna ruffle some feathers with this analogy, but suppose a person is an alcoholic and he says, I know I need to quit drinking. I'm gonna do it gradually. I'm gonna drink only a couple of drinks a day. Like when you go off, you kind of need to go off cold turkey. And I think that from a sociological and psychological point of view, it would be best to make a clean break for people who really want to start considering using a different approach, because the psychological pull of being able to say consensus supports this, I think it's had a very negative effect upon apologetics, and that people need psychologically to get over a feeling that they're relying on that or that they need that. Now, that's a psychological point. A more epistemological point would be, if I were to try to use something that even looked at all similar, I would probably use it for a different conclusion, not for the resurrection, because I don't really think the resurrection is clearly the best explanation of just the minimal facts. I mean, it's because they're so minimal. We'll get into that in a moment. But maybe instead I would use something that would be a cousin of it to respond to Jesus mythos or something. Just Jesus existed, okay? That's a place where I really can say, why such a huge consensus of scholars thinks that mythicists are out there in tinfoil hat land? Because here's the evidence that Jesus existed. It's just absolutely overwhelming. And we really can, with a good conscience, combine a knowledge of the concrete evidence with a reference, being careful how we do it, to broad consensus there, and it works in a sense because mythicism really is so far out there. Or possibly to respond to one very particular alternative to the resurrection, like, were the disciples simply cynical, insincere money grubbers or something like that?
Yeah.
When you get this scholarly consensus that they were at least sincere religious believers in something or other, and there's a reason for that because of the way that they changed their lives and ordered their lives and that kind of thing. There appears to be something they were really sincere about. But notice that's much more limited than arguing for the resurrection. And the minimal facts argument is, by definition, it's an argument for the resurrection. That would be only an argument for a much more limited conclusion.
Okay. I think that's fair. Thank you.
If I'm a proponent of this approach, a minimal facts approach, I might say something like, well, this saves a lot of time because I don't want to argue for a long time. I want to use things that my opponent would agree on as the premises, and then we'll argue over the conclusions or the best explanation. And so I'm sort of shifting the ground, place where I have to do battle to the conclusion rather than trying to figure out what we agree on. Those would be my main concerns, is that I for a long time, I've been convinced that, if I'm going to argue, I would want to argue using data that are agreed upon by the person I'm arguing with. And what's your response to that position?
I would sort of break it down into several places. So first of all, we want to be sure to respond to any notion that a non-minimal facts approach is question begging. Sometimes I think that's lurking at the back of people's minds, that you didn't say it, and they don't usually, that's not usually put that way. I found a hint of this, however, in Dale Allison's recent book on the resurrection. When he criticized Tim and me, he misunderstood us and said they assume detailed factuality or detailed facticity, was his phrase, of the gospel resurrection narratives. Now, that's not accurate. Obviously, it would be question begging to say, hey, here are the gospel resurrection narratives. they are true. Therefore, Jesus rose from the dead. I mean, that's obviously circular, right? I mean, it's a resurrection narrative, and you're assuming it's true. You're assuming Jesus' resurrection, which is assuming what you're supposed to be proving. So in terms of starting with something granted by the opponent, in a sense, everybody starts with something, quote unquote, granted, like, for example, that the Gospels exist. There they are. These are documents, and that they purport to be narrating the facts about what happened to Jesus and about his resurrection. So there's no circularity. In fact, as you'll see when I try to give a sort of a dry run here, which we'll probably do in a few minutes here, the big sort of controversial thing that we're using as a premise is still not circular, which is that they represent what the people in a position to know claimed. Well, that's still not circular because, I could have an account of somebody who claims he saw Bigfoot, and it's coming from the guy who says it happened to him and he was in the woods yesterday. And it's not controversial that this is what that person claimed. So it's not question begging to say that, but I still don't think he really saw Bigfoot. So there's no circularity. So that's the first point I would want to make. Second point, as far as time and speed, the maximalist type of approach, just like the minimal facts type of approach, lends itself to a variety of speeds. You can do a elevator pitch version. You can do a 15-minute version. You can do a 30-minute version. Or, like Michael Licona and Bart Ehrman did recently, a 7-hour version. All right, they literally did a 7-hour, and one of my friends said to me, boy, after this, I hope I'm not going to see people anymore saying, you got to use the minimal facts approach because otherwise it's going to take too long. Obviously, if you can spend 7 hours on an argument that is ultimately based on that historical bedrock or minimal facts approach, then, I could do a 7-hour version as well of the maximal approach. So you choose your level of specificity. And there's one other point I would want to make before we get to illustrating different levels of speed. You will find that people who are using minimal facts will often, though they may not be self-conscious of it, be tacitly assuming that when the disciples believed a certain thing, like the disciples believed that Jesus rose from the dead or that he was physically raised, they were reasonable to believe that. The skeptic is not going to grant that. So in a sense, the minimal facts people aren't really just basing it on things that the skeptic is going to grant either. That is to say, the skeptic is going to say, yeah, religious people believe lots of irrational things, okay? So you will find this end run where they'll say, well, if the experiences hadn't been very good, they wouldn't have believed it. It's like, you got to be kidding me. No skeptic worth his salt is going to grant you that if they hadn't had really good, really indicative experiences, they wouldn't have believed Jesus was risen from the dead. They're going to challenge you right at that point, too. So you get fairly early on in the even minimal facts approach to things that the skeptic is not going to grant either. So in some ways, that's an illusion that you're just basing it on things that the skeptic is going to grant.
One thing that comes to mind is this idea of consensus and using what is the common consensus. Can you just say, oh, yeah, I don't, maybe that's problematic because the consensus changes and who says that so-and-so believes this or that? And why don't you just go with the things that are most well evidenced instead and still construct a minimal facts approach using well evidenced facts? And so you maybe short circuit the issue with having to depend upon scholarly consensus. Does that help at all in someone who wants to use a minimal facts approach, or is that still problematic?
That's automatically maximalist. I mean, that's what I'm doing. I mean,
Okay.
I think that the idea that the disciples or the people in position to know actually claim this is enormously well evidenced, overwhelmingly well evidenced. So then that's not minimalist anymore. I mean, basically, to call something like that a minimal facts approach would just confuse everybody. It really is quite central to the whole minimal facts approach for the very reason you just gave a moment ago, the idea being of, to save time and whatnot, or to rely on something to be able to sort of take consensus and bonk your opponent over the head with it, as it were, to to rely on things that are very strongly evidenced. Dr. Habermas has called that this is required by our method. He has a methodological review of Dr. Lacona's 2010 book. It's something like Minimal Facts, Argument for the Resurrection of Jesus, the Crucial Role of Methodology. It's a long title. I don't remember the whole title, but and he makes it very clear that he believes that reliance on, or that use of consensus, is actually methodologically important to guard against bias. Both he and Dr. Lacona have said this. So it's just not going to be a minimal facts approach anymore. If you're going with what's most well evidenced, I would really say that is kind of what I'm doing.
Okay. So you might sound like I'm being cheeky here, but I'm just trying to figure out when a case turns from minimal to maximal, because what if I looked at, say, Lacona's book and just took out the parts where it said scholarly consensus, and I just simply used that as the starting point for what would be well evidenced?
I see what you're saying. Just use those same things that I follow you, the things that he labels as historical bedrock, or as Habermas calls it, minimal facts. I believe that Habermas views these as being interchangeable terms, by the way, and just didn't say anything about the scholarly consensus, but just use those facts.
Yeah, I think
that's what you're saying.
Yeah, because to my mind, if I was the skeptic, I'd be like, I don't care what people say. I want to know what the reasons are for them believing these things, and then I'll evaluate the reasons. But to my mind, maybe the shortcut would be, well, I could start with looking at what the scholars all seem to agree upon and think, well, it would seem to me that the reason they believe that is it's well evidenced. And so that would be a starting point. And then you could build from that and then defend those reasons. But yeah, maybe I'm crossing my wires or not understanding.
I'm following you now, though. You're talking about using those specific facts.
Yeah.
Well, the first thing I would do is I would issue a caution about using a fact of consensus as our reason for believing that something is well evidenced. That's shaky. And one of the things that we've found as the years have gone on, and as I've looked into these things, is that Dr. Lacona is out there using the notion of a varied scholarly consensus. What word should I use? Approach varied. There are evangelicals who believe this, there are liberals who believe this, etc., to support some very different kinds of things, like that the Gospel of John is changing some things. So like take changing the date of the temple cleansing, for example, or John substantially embellishing discourses. I have seen him use the fact, hey, there are evangelicals who believe this, there are liberals who believe this, there are a wide variety of scholars, and basically, who do you think you are to go up against this? So we need to be very careful, because in a field like New Testament and biblical studies, where there's an enormous amount of social pressure, you can have things that are held by a consensus that are really completely wrong. As indeed, I think some of those views of the Gospel of John are completely wrong. I think it is robustly historical. So that would be my first caution. Don't assume that because something is held by a wide consensus of scholars across the scholarly spectrum, or at least the label spectrum, that it is therefore well evidenced. But the other thing is, as we'll probably talk about more, you'll probably want to follow up on this, if you use those facts that are listed as bedrock, and there's only like 3 or 4 of them, I don't think you're really going to have a very strong argument for the resurrection. And that's the central problem. That's where where the rubber really meets the road, that it's just not enough. So we can talk more about that and why I think it's not enough. But
yeah, one of the things that you mentioned in your interview with Cameron Bertuzzi on Capturing Christianity was this, one of those facts is that, and I may not quote this verbatim, but it's something along that the disciples claimed and believed that they had appearances, that Jesus appeared to them. One of the things that you had brought up is that a lot of times certain scholars are quoted as affirming that fact. For example, Gerd Ludemann. But in reality, he obviously doesn't believe they actually saw the risen Jesus. right? That they explain this in a different way. Am I characterizing that correctly?
Well, it's a little bit different from that, actually.
Oh, okay.
So,
okay.
and yeah, I've heard people characterize my concern that way, and I want to correct that a little. My concern isn't that Ludeman doesn't believe they really saw Jesus. I mean, that's kind of obvious, right? If he's not a believer, he's not going to believe that they really saw Jesus. It's worse. It's worse than that. Ludeman doesn't believe that they even claimed that they had the kinds of detailed experiences that we find in the gospel narratives. Okay, he doesn't even think they claimed that. Okay, he says that all of those detailed physical things were embellished, like eating with them and long conversations, etc., were embellishments that were added later by other people who were not witnesses. Okay, so the problem with the appearance claim is, and with taking someone like Ludeman out of context and quoting him, is that it gets quoted, it may, I don't have the exact quote from Ludeman, but you'll see it all over the place, and it just makes me grind my teeth. It's something like, it may be taken as certain that the disciples had experiences which they took to be experiences of the risen Jesus, something like that.
Yes, I've heard that too.
Yeah, it's that quote. And it's like, he doesn't tell us anything about what he even thinks they said those experiences were like. And he explicitly says that all the physical stuff was added later. And he says the original seeing was a seeing in the spirit. Well, what in the world is a seeing in the spirit? I mean, for all that, it could have been like any kind of a claim. They could have said, hey, we were all sitting around and we had this overwhelming sense that Jesus was present with us. I mean, it could have been like their original claims could have been extremely unimpressive, evidentially. So it's not just that Ludeman doesn't believe that they really saw Jesus. It's worse. It's that Ludeman doesn't believe that they even claimed that they had experiences that would be dispositive or evidentially strong if they had those real experiences. They might have claimed to have had much weaker and much less, and then have jumped to the conclusion that this means Jesus was risen, which is a reason why I emphasize so much the question of whether they were rational or not.
So that's why it would be faulty if, say, someone presented up front, this group of scholars, I just want to make sure I understand you on this. Mm-hmm. So this group of scholars, they all agree that the disciples believe they saw something. So they believe that. And so obviously they all don't believe that they actually saw something. But I can argue to the best explanation that the best explanation is that they saw a physical Jesus. You're saying, if I'm hearing you right, and I may not be, if I'm hearing you right, that the minimal facts argument can't get you to a physical resurrection. Is that right?
Yeah, because the content of even the claimed experiences is too minimal. So let me give you an example. Bart Ehrman has corrected the impression that he grants group experiences. I actually asked him about this in a comment on his, subscriber-only blog.
Oh, yeah, the Ehrman blog.
A few years ago, yeah. So I just paid a subscription fee, and then I asked him a question. I'm like, do you grant group experiences? And that they actually had a group appearance. And if so, what do you think it was like? And he said, I don't. He said, I do not grant group appearances. And then he said, but if there were any, I think it was like a Marian apparition. It was like a picture seen at a distance. Well, now let's think about that for a minute. Let's suppose that you have people and they're together, and let's suppose that the content of it actually was like Jesus, sort of a ghostly form of Jesus sort of pops in front of them for a couple of minutes, and you can see through it. It's like actually transparent. And they're like, oh my goodness, or whatever the Aramaic equivalent of oh my goodness is, that's, it's Jesus. Do you see what I see? And then they hear this voice saying, all is well. I have returned to the Father, and peace be with you. Boom, he disappears. Is the best explanation of that Jesus is risen from the dead? No. best explanation. I mean, even if there's not a good naturalistic explanation, like some kind of religious hysteria or something, if we even extend it as far as to allow a paranormal experience, I think Dale Allison has really pointed to a weakness in the minimal facts approach, because he's really into the paranormal. I mean, I think that guy practically believes in ghosts. You know, I mean, if you allow for that possibility, why does Jesus say to the disciples, touch and handle me and see that a spirit does not have flesh and bones as you see that I have? Well, because for a minute they thought he might have been a ghost, and then he evidenced that he wasn't. But we're not going to get that from scholarly consensus. We're not even going to get that they claim that he said that from scholarly consensus. The scholars don't think that they even claimed that he said that. So if all you have is, well, they all saw something or something happened, you could have Peter has a hallucination. This, by the way, I think may have actually been Ludemann's belief. Peter and maybe Mary Magdalene had individual hallucinations, and then they got all the other people excited, and they had some kind of, joint, Allison likes the phrase, sense of presence, a sense of presence. Well, what the heck is a sense of presence? There are people who have I sense the presence of my dead father or something, but they don't think their dead father rose from the dead. Right. Okay, so the problem is, if all you have is, read the careful wording of the minimal facts or the historical bedrock. It's something like, subsequent to Jesus' death, the disciples had an experience which they interpreted to be an appearance of the risen Jesus. Think of all the options that you can fit in under that heading, and many of them not well explained by a true physical resurrection.
Okay, so the best the minimal facts can get us is maybe a ghost Jesus.
Well, or kind of like when I hear really interesting near-death experience stories or ghost stories or whatever, I go, I wonder what happened there. It's kind of weird. Something weird happened. Either that or they're totally lying. And what do? I go about my life, right? I mean, I don't change my entire life, I think the best you could hope to do with the minimal facts, if you were super honest about it, would be something weird happened. Something. We're not sure what,
Okay.
Right.
All right. So we've got a problem with what the minimal facts can grant. We've got a problem with relying on consensus for making an argument, but also about finding out what is well evidenced. And then we also have a problem with using a very small data set, or maybe an arbitrarily limited data set, which isn't very powerful in its conclusion. Is there anything else we want to add to that list?
That sums it up. And I would say maybe also with overselling it, I think there are a lot of people out there that when they do a minimal facts approach, they think scholars grant more than they really grant. They think that the scholars grant that they actually had experiences, or at least claimed that they had experiences that were much richer experiences.
In a sense, it's misrepresentation of scholars.
I think there's confusion. I mean, I think people just get confused. And I think it arises because Dr. Habermas makes these very strong claims. He'll go say, I can rule out all naturalistic alternatives using only what is granted by this very large consensus of scholars. That's a big claim. That's a big promise. And so then because of that big promise, people are like, well, then the scholars must grant an awful lot. There's an article that was published in The Stream, I think it was in 2018, by Dr. Habermas, and the title was, and of course the editors always write the title. I'm not saying he wrote the title, but it was something like Surprising Scholarly Consensus on Facts That Support Jesus' Resurrection. And in what he wrote, he moved seamlessly from the minimal facts stated carefully to something like, and then was Jesus seen just a few days later having conversations with his friends just like anyone else? And I'm going, whoa, that isn't granted. The majority of scholars don't grant that his friends had experiences like, or even claim to have experiences like he was just having a whole conversation with them just like anyone else. And so I think a lot of people, and it's because of things like that people get confused and that the argument gets oversold. So I have no doubt that there are probably hundreds of completely honest apologists out there who are overselling the minimal facts because they don't really know just how minimal they really are. So,
Back to when we were talking about the reasons that it's so popular, there are debates, and we see those debates, and people often emulate what they see or hear. And if that's the only thing they see or hear or read, then this just becomes sort of like, well, this is standard issue weaponry for the apologetics infantry. Here's your bullets for minimal facts.
yes.
So part of the reason for having the conversation today is, my thought is, I'm all for hearing alternative approaches. And if we can use more data, super, you can make a stronger case. And the other thing is that I want to make an available resource where people can say, oh, well, this is... Now, if I see this demonstrated, then I can argue like that as well. Show me a method of argumentation that doesn't have these same holes in it, then I'll use that. So, Lydia, if you wouldn't mind, show us another way where we can argue for the resurrection using non-limited data set, not relying on scholarly consensus and the other issues we've mentioned before.
Sure. Okay, elevator pitch version. After Jesus died, his disciples, about 6 weeks later, began claiming that he had risen from the dead. And they claimed that he had appeared to them in a very physical way. Now, there are three possible explanations for the claims that they made. First, maybe they were lying. Second, maybe they were honestly mistaken, and they really thought he had risen from the dead, but he hadn't really. And third, they were right, and what they said was true. Now, a lot of people say a lot of crazy things. We don't automatically believe just what anybody tells us. So let's examine those three options. First of all, the context in which they testified is strong evidence that they were not lying. This wasn't just a context of persecution. It was a context where they could have simply remained silent, and they were going to be persecuted for the very things they were saying. In other words, for saying it at all, instead of just going back to practicing their Jewish background, which was their background, and just leaving it. They didn't have to speak up or say anything, and they knew that they were in danger of their lives for doing so. That makes it very unlikely that they were just lying. But secondly, the content of what they said makes it very difficult to say that they were honestly mistaken. Could you be honestly mistaken if you and a couple dozen of your friends testified that you spent a couple of weeks on, summer vacation, on summer break with a mutual best friend, and you had many conversations and you went to meals together and stuff, and you knew him, you knew what he looked like, and he was there? That's not the kind of thing that's easy to be honestly mistaken about. And that's the kind of thing that they claimed. They claimed they were able to eat with him and talk with him at length and recognize him. They were given every opportunity. And so that really makes it improbable that they were honestly mistaken, leaving us with the option, which is the best explanation of these claims that they made, that they were actually telling the truth. Okay, there's your elevator pitch version. So I've tried to strip that as much as possible, and you can see how short that can be made. Now, obviously, that's not all you're going to do in like a debate context. You're going to have maybe a 15 to 30-minute opening statement. So that's why I call this the elevator version, more like something you would give in a brief conversation with somebody, where you're not expected to make an opening statement. In a debate, that's going to be a little bit longer.
So my first impression is it's sort of like a trilemma, except for...
It is only applied to the disciples.
Yes.
So they're either lying, mistaken, or it was true. And the only main claim is that, after he died, they began claiming he rose from the dead and he appeared to them. And the way that he appeared to them was in a physical way. And so you could defend that using all kinds of New Testament, basically the whole New Testament, it would seem to me.
But especially the Gospels.
Yeah.
And you'll see when I give the slightly longer version, you'll also see in the 35-minute version that I did for the Areopagus Forum on Good Friday this year, how we go to those gospel narratives to argue that this is really what this is really what they claimed. This was really the content of their claims. And notice, I think the content is pretty memorable. Kind of pleased with that. That's something, the context makes it very unlikely that they were deceivers. The content makes it very unlikely that they were mistaken or deceived, which leaves us with they're telling the truth.
So the only other thought I have before you go into the longer version is I'm trying to think of this from the perspective of a skeptic, and you present that argument to me. If I were to bring up the objection of, well, I don't believe what is recorded in the Gospels is reliable, is that where you make a case for the reliability of the Gospels?
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly. That's exactly where it goes. But notice in the service of supporting that this is what the people close to it claimed.
Yes.
It's not like the Gospels are reliable. Gospels say Jesus rose from the dead, so Jesus rose from the dead. It's
Right.
a little more nuanced. It's more nuanced than that.
Yeah, I really like the way that you worded it there, and I did notice you worded it very carefully, which I really appreciated.
But of course, skeptics will question that too. They'll be like, no, I don't think that's what they claimed. And that, of course, is the foundation of my criticism of the minimal facts. That if we really go with what skeptical scholars grant, they don't even grant that that's what they claimed.
Mm-hmm.
I think that comes as a shock to people. It's like, whoa, wait, what? They don't even grant that the disciples claimed what's found in the gospel narratives. They think that a lot of that stuff was added later, by the telephone game, etc., as Bart Ehrman likes to say.
So under the second possible explanation where they're mistaken, wouldn't a skeptic point to scholars who say, well, look, here's X number of scholars who say that it was a apparition or some sort of hallucination? Does that push the argument back on that ground again, or?
I think that is easy to respond to. I mean, I hope they do that. That would be actually like, yeah, please do that. Because if the disciples, the people in a position to know, really claimed that they ate with him, that they had lengthy conversations with him, and so forth, that is not well explained by a ghost. That is not well explained by a hallucination or an apparition. I mean, even Dale Allison, for all that he loves his paranormal, has to admit that we do not have ghost stories that, are coming from people who claim to have, where you've had all of these things coming together. It's a group of people. They're interacting with him polymodally. They're reaching out and able to touch him. They're all interacting simultaneously. So Jesus says, hey, pass the fish, okay? And, you hand something to him, etc. What does it just fall on the ground? And where you are having lengthy conversations, Allison even admits that even where people claim to have auditory experiences, these are usually short, or it's usually one person who claims she had a conversation with her dead husband or whatever. Whereas what we have here is we have people who were claiming that they all were together with him, or multiple of them were together with him. The two guys who walked on the road to Emmaus claimed that they had this whole 3-mile walk with him, where they're having this whole big long conversation. That does not look like a ghost. That is not well explained. Now, of course, Allison doesn't believe that. He still wants to hold open some kind of a visionary thing, and he thinks these details were added later. He's one of those scholars who thinks that these are embellishments. But if these are really the things that they claimed, then we can argue very robustly that that is not well explained by an apparition or hallucination.
In your experience, does it push the argument back to defending gospel reliability way more than defending which explanation counts for the data, or? Yeah,
I think if you expand it out, and when I do a slightly more expanded version, I'll suggest that on the content claim, the person should dwell more upon the details of that content, like I just did,
Okay.
But yes, the time is going to be spent if you have a knowledgeable enough opponent to force you to do this in discussing whether the accounts are embellished.
Okay.
That's where the time is going to come in, Whereas what you find in debates based on minimal facts is that the time comes in more in arguing whether they that really is the best explanation.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, look, people spend whole debates debating even when the minimal facts is used. Bart Ehrman, or whoever it might be, does not hear the minimal facts and say, okay, I'm done. I believe in the resurrection now.
Yeah.
Okay? So you're going to be spending time one way or another.
Yeah.
So it's just a question of where that time is going to be spent.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I remember hearing Gary Habermas many years ago in a lecture, and the way he introduced the talk, was talking about, well, he gets the Bible and says, well, I'm going to talk to the skeptic. Well, the skeptic will say, well, I don't believe what's in this book. He's like, okay, well, what will you believe? I'll believe what the scholars say. So, okay, well, let me build a case using what the scholars say. So it seems to me his whole goal, I would take it to be, is he would not want to fight over gospel reliability. He'd rather fight over the explanation of what historians agree on. And I suppose that would be maybe a philosophical sort of like preference too. But I mean, to my mind, if you're going to fight over the explanation of something, maybe you'd be fighting for the reliability of the gospels instead of just throwing that out. Like, okay, well, that's not worth fighting for. I mean, in this case, you get to get both the resurrection and the gospel reliability.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's going to be useful for other things like doctrine.
Yeah.
And this is one reason it's good to get gospel reliability as well, because a certain slogan is false. And that slogan is, if the resurrection happened, Christianity is true, period. How many of us have heard that? It's not true. It's not true. Mormons believe in the resurrection. Okay? Biblical Unitarians, quote unquote, believe in the resurrection. The Socinians, modern day Socinians, believe in the resurrection. Okay? What's the difference? Well, what did the resurrection support? All right? If you're an Orthodox Christian, you're bringing in doctrine, right? Like Jesus is God, for example. Okay? Like the Trinity. Okay? Or like, okay, where are we getting a lot of that? From Jesus' teaching. Well, if you don't have gospel reliability, then how do you get Jesus' teaching? Well, so where I'm going with this is, if you do have gospel reliability, you have reliable recording of Jesus' teaching, which is going to give you a rich well of doctrine as well, which you then put together with the resurrection and you say, and that's what the resurrection confirmed. It confirmed this man's teaching, and this is what this man taught, and that's how it confirms Christianity.
Wow. So that idea, because I've heard that too. What is it? It's often said like this: if God exists and Jesus rose from the dead, then Christianity's true. That's how I've heard it put. But it's the same thing as what you said. Whereas what I'm hearing you say is that we've got all these other, whether you want to call them cults or false teachings, that would affirm that you need the Gospels in order to show what the genuine article is. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, Jesus' teaching.
Never thought
or people
of that.
who say that Paul perverted, the people who want to throw Paul out of the canon, that Paul perverted the gospel or whatever, and that it's in conflict with what Jesus taught. Well, if you're going to refute that, you're going to need to know what Jesus taught, and the gospels are our source for that. So that's why it's great to get, like Brian was saying, to get both, to get the gospel's reliability and Jesus' resurrection as well. And what we've seen as this minimalist approach, and hey, let's not try to argue for the Gospels, has become more and more popular, is an attempt even to do doctrine without that. Now, I'm gonna bring up something here. Reasonable Faith by Dr. William Lane Craig has a whole chapter on Christ's self-concept. I think the Jesus self-understanding is the name of the chapter. I've read that chapter, and unless I'm just missing something, you will not find before Abraham was I am, or I and the Father are one, cited in support of Jesus' self-understanding in that chapter. Instead, he attempts to get to the idea that Jesus believed and taught that he was God in a far more roundabout way, using the concept of the Danielic Son of Man and other passages to argue that it's much more indirect and it's tying your hand behind your back. And the reason for that is the very same reason for which the minimal facts argument was developed, that we don't want to be using gospel reliability. And which gospel gets attacked most? John.
Yeah.
And particularly the accounts of Jesus' teachings in John. Now, I am not saying, I don't want people to mishear me, that Dr. Craig doesn't believe that Jesus said those things. I'm sure he does.
Sure.
But he won't use it to argue for Jesus' divine self-understanding because it isn't granted by scholarship. And so he's trying to use the critical scholarly method, what is known as the criteriological approach, and artificially limit himself to that in order to have what he believes to be a better case or a more somehow resilient case for Jesus' self-understanding. I call this the Yugo model. You all know what a Yugo is. It's this car, okay? But nobody ever said
Not a great car.
that the Yugo was a great car. So we have this notion that when we strip everything away, we get a better case. That's not right. As an epistemologist, that's not a good way to approach it. So that's why what Brian said is good that we get both.
Yeah, and you know what comes to mind, Lydia, and you know this much better than I, but there are some evangelical scholars in recent years who have called in, for example, the I am sayings in John. They've called those into question, right?
Yep. Craig Evans, in particular, has strongly called those into question.
Yeah, that was one of the names I was thinking of. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
We have a diverse consensus.
Yeah.
John didn't, the guy that Jesus didn't say them.
Right.
Okay, so now maybe we should go to something more like 15-minute version.
Sure. Just let me get the popcorn and all right, I'm all set.
Okay, you got your popcorn, so we're good. So I'm going to cheat just a little bit here by saying the 15-minute version begins like the 1-minute version. So people could rewind the tape, listen to my elevator version. You start that way. Maybe you expand a little bit. I would advise on the content of their testimony is really strong evidence that they were not mistaken. I would maybe advise in a 15-minute version, you go into a little more detail. You say things like, they said that they had long conversations with him. It was different groups of people that claimed, not entirely overlapping groups of people. So that gives us some measure of independence, that claimed they had conversations with him. They claimed to eat meals with him together as groups. This would involve polymodality, hearing, seeing, touching, all at the same time in a realistic, real-world manner. And they claimed that those were the kinds of experiences that they had. The different groups of people give us some degree of independence, too, in terms of the social pressures brought to bear upon them. So the women would have been under different social pressures from the men, for example. Jesus' brother James would have been under different social pressures as a person who was not his follower from the people who had already been his followers and so forth. So expand upon that a little bit. And then you do the trilemma, inference to the best explanation that I did in the elevator pitch version. And then I would recommend making a kind of pivot. And you say, now, what is the skeptic's best chance to try to refute this? If you're a skeptic, what's your best chance to try to reject this conclusion that Jesus rose from the dead? Well, your best chance is to go right back to the beginning and say, no, they did not claim that at all. And then to unite that with some version of honestly mistaken. To say that they claimed something far, far more minimal, just that they all had some kind of experience and they were just sure that Jesus was risen. They were sure in their hearts somehow, but they weren't really rational or reasonable in that. And they were honestly mistaken because basically religious people are not very reasonable. So that they jumped to a conclusion, basically. Maybe they thought that Jesus, if he were to be really a complete person, and if he were really to have triumphed over death, this would have to involve his being physically raised. So he must have been physically raised, but not because they actually had experiences that made it reasonable for them to think he was physically raised. That would be your best shot as a skeptic. Well, okay, how would we respond to that then? We would say, I would argue as a Christian, I would say, okay, well, we know we have these accounts. There they are. They're out there. We all know that they exist. We all know they've existed from ancient times. What are these accounts? These gospels in which these accounts occur, in which they appear. What kind of documents are they? What kind of authors are they? Very strong case can be made that these documents and these authors are people close to the facts. They may be actual disciples of Jesus. Two of them were attributed from very early times to disciples of Jesus. And one of them, the Gospel of John, actually contains a claim right in it that it was written by a personal disciple of Jesus. The disciple, it says, whom Jesus loved. And two of them were all believed uniformly, going right back to the threshold of the apostolic age, to have been written by companions of the disciples, Mark and Luke. And the Gospel of Luke, he even says that he's followed these things carefully from the beginning and wants to give a careful account. Now, does the content bear that out? We're looking at a cumulative case here. The Gospels present themselves as historical in nature, and they were believed to be written by people in a strong position to know. But is that true? Are they careful? Are they historical? Are they written by people in a strong position to know? Well, there are two different categories of types of evidence that I believe strongly support that conclusion. One is what we call external types of evidence, and one is what we call internal types of evidence. And there's a vast wealth of this. In a short time, I can only give you examples. For external evidence, for example, we have cultural types of evidence. One instance of this would be the implication in both Luke and John that two different people could be called the high priest at the same time, despite the fact that in the Old Testament it would appear that only one person could be high priest at a time. We find this confirmed in the Jewish historian Josephus, who actually refers to multiple people as high priests who were alive at the same time. This was due to the practice of the Romans in deposing and appointing new high priests. We also find geographical notes that show familiarity with actually being there, such as John mentioning the distance from Bethany to Jerusalem, which can be confirmed. We find references to places in Jerusalem that were all destroyed in 70 with the destruction of Jerusalem, showing that these were people familiar with the pre-Jerusalem, or the pre-destruction Jerusalem. And those are just a few examples of the many, many kinds of external details we have. We have even more of such external confirmations of the book of Acts, which was in fact written, universally acknowledged and undeniably true by the same guy who wrote the book of Luke, whoever he was. Vast numbers of external confirmations, such as the location of a little island called Cauda off the coast of Crete, which other contemporary authors got wrong. But Luke gets it right in his account of the voyage of Paul. But that's just beginning. We have internal evidences. There's something that police do. It's called forensic statement analysis, where we look at a statement and we look at what we know about how people talk, and we try to figure out if this looks like a believable, credible witness from the characteristics that it has. The Gospels have these characteristics of witness testimony. One example of this is what I call unexplained allusions. I've coined that term. These are places, and you'll see it if you ever get your friends to tell you a story or your grandparents to tell you a story. They make allusions to things and they forget that they need to explain what this is. So if someone refers to COVID lockdowns to someone who lives 200 years from now, maybe that person's never heard of COVID lockdowns, okay? And if they don't pause to explain, you might never find out. John does this, for example, when he's narrating about an argument in John chapter 3 that some disciples of John the Baptist had. It just says, with a Jew about purification. And they came to John the Baptist and started complaining, then it tells, about Jesus' disciples baptizing more people. They were jealous. But look what gets dropped. The dispute about purification. We never find out what that dispute was about. Whether John the Baptist resolved it in one direction or another, what the details were, was it with one of Jesus' disciples? We're left guessing. That is the mark of authenticity right there, of a person who knew what really happened. Or in John chapter 2, he tells about the marriage at Cana, and then it says, and a few days later, Jesus and his disciples and his mother and brothers went down to Capernaum, and they stayed there a few days. Full stop. And then it goes, and it was about the time of Passover, and they went to Jerusalem, and blah, 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 blah. Like, okay, what was that all about that visit to Capernaum? That's the kind of thing your buddy does when he just throws in this completely irrelevant thing. And then he kind of drops it and he moves on with his story. He doesn't want to interrupt his story to tell the whole thing. Marks of truth. There's another kind of internal evidence known as undesigned coincidences. I have a whole book on this. There are dozens of them. Between the Gospels and also between Acts and Paul's letters. I'm going to give just one example. In Matthew, when he's about to tell about the beheading of John the Baptist, he tells us that Herod was musing on who in the world Jesus could be, and he said to his servants, "This must be John the Baptist risen from the dead." To his servants, well, that's unique to Matthew. Not found in Mark, not found in Luke, even though they tell the story in similar terms. Which was Matthew just making that up, trying to make it more vivid, wants to tell people who he said it to. How could Matthew know what Herod was saying to his servants, for goodness sake? Well, go over to Luke 8. Not talking about John the Baptist. It's not talking about his beheading or anything. It's a completely different context. Luke lists some women who were in Jesus' followers who contributed apparently financially to his ministry. And it starts listing them. It lists Mary Magdalene. It lists Susanna. And it lists a woman named Joanna. And it says the wife of Chuza, Herod's steward or household manager. And then Luke moves on. He's not thinking about Matthew's passage if he had even recently read it. But that's how the Christians could know what Herod said to his servants. Because his household manager had a wife who was a follower of Jesus, and therefore probably the household manager was also a follower of Jesus as well, or he wouldn't have allowed his wife to be one. So a little bit of conversation between the two of them, and, the boss was really upset today about Jesus, etc. And that's just one, and there are dozens of these. There are other kinds of confirmations internal of the honesty of the Gospels. For example, we find them stopping to separate their own interpretations from Jesus' words. When Mark reports that Jesus said that it's not what goes in that defiles a man, but what comes forth from the heart, he pauses and says, "This he said, making all meats clean." So what does he not do? He doesn't make Jesus say, "So therefore all meats are clean." He doesn't make Jesus address a contemporary dispute that the early church was talking about. He doesn't put words into Jesus' mouth. He tries to report what Jesus said historically and separates that from his own interpretation of it. And we find many of these, especially in the Gospel of John as well, who is sometimes the most suspected of putting his own words in Jesus' mouth, but it ain't so. Now, these are just some of the external and internal confirmations. What do we get from this? That the Gospel authors are knowledgeable, that they're careful, that they're deeply embedded in the time and in the culture. And when we reflect that the genre of highly super realistic historical fiction was not going to be invented for 1,700 years more, and that there was no Google in which you could look up these external facts, there were no reference libraries where you could go and look at a map and find out where Cauda was, it's all the more impressive, which leads us to the conclusion that these were not the kinds of authors to incorporate things that they just made up because they thought it would sound good, embellishments to make Jesus look like he wasn't a ghost, or stories that came at the end of a long line of changes and gossip, like the telephone game you might have played when you were a kid, as Bart Ehrman says. That's not what these Gospels look like at all. And that brings us back to the proposition that this is really what the disciples claimed. And if that's really what they claimed, that brings us back to that trilemma, which brings us to the question, did Jesus really rise from the dead? And who is he? And what is his claim on your life? There's my 15-minute version.
Well, super. For those who want to hear the fuller version of that even more, yeah, we'll include that link in the show notes. And Lydia, we've got links to your other talks and stuff. If someone wants to learn more about like defending the resurrection from this maximal data approach, where did they begin to learn about that, or what resources are available to them for that?
Well, as you can see, the maximal data approach, where a lot of that work comes in, is reliability of the Gospels. So I strongly would suggest that they have a look at my 3 New Testament books. I've also sent to my publisher a 4th one recently, and hopefully this will be out in 2023. And that's meant for a lay audience, and it's even going to have like study questions included. I'm going to send you a lot more links, including to what I call a playlist on YouTube on the minimal facts, maximal data, where I get into probability theory and these kinds of things, and how that intersects with some problems with the minimal facts approach. My YouTube channel in general, it's just, Lydia McGrew, and we got a podcast version of it now because Eric Manning of Testify has taken the audio and sent it to Anchor FM, which pushes it out to Spotify and so forth. If you don't feel like you need to sit and watch me talk and you just want to hear the audio part, that's caught up to date already. I'm doing a series right now on the Gospel of John on that YouTube channel. So there's just a wealth of both free and paid resources available on that. And if you want a really long webinar, I'll try to send this, called Minimal Facts versus Maximal Data, that I did for several years ago for Jonathan McClatchy's show, Apologetics Academy. So there are a lot of different places, but most of all, you're really studying maximal data when you're studying the reliability of the Gospels.
Excellent.
Well, super. Lydia, I know we've taken a lot of time and that we've covered a lot of ground as well. And obviously there's a lot more resources available to people. And we'll wrap it up there. But thank you so much for your time. It's been a real pleasure. And thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
It's been great, Brian and Chad. Thank you so much for having me. And I hope I've been able to answer your questions.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast. We also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice. And please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Auten and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.